What if you were a lawyer who was sentenced to go to jail? Or what if you were an aphasiologist, as I am, an expert in the language, speech, and swallowing problems of individuals who've had strokes, and a stroke left you a prisoner in your own body? On June 15th, 2013, I was driving with my wife Shelley on the Northern State Parkway from our apartment in Manhattan to our beach house in Montauk at the eastern end of Long Island. It was about an hour and a half into the trip. Honey, I have to get off the highway. Something's not right. Is it you or the car? There's a stabbing pain in my eye, and my body feels weird. I turned off at the next exit and onto a two-lane road, crossing over to the other side and into a driveway, out of the flow of traffic. I turned off the car and immediately lost all movement in my right side. I started to talk, and my speech was unintelligible. My thoughts were clear, and I wondered if I would be able to speak. After all, a right side paralysis is often associated with left frontal cerebral hemisphere damage and Broca's aphasia, a language disorder. But if I had aphasia, wouldn't I have difficulty using language to organize my thoughts? I started to speak, and it was clear that I did not have aphasia, but that I did have dysarthria. My pronunciation had imprecise consonant formation, reduced rate of speech, and irregular articulatory breakdown. I associated these symptoms with ataxic dysarthria, like the speech of an inebriated person. An embolism, that is, a traveling blood clot, was working its way into my brainstem. I told my wife that I was having a stroke, and I asked her for 2 aspirin while I could still swallow. I was actually having a TIA, a transient ischemic attack, where the symptoms come and go. I would have 2 more TIAs in the ambulance on the way to the hospital in Long Island, and at least another 6 in the intensive care unit where I would be spending the next 7 days. Doctors prescribed loading doses of powerful blood thinners to try to prevent a major stroke. But I had a major stroke the next day, and the blood thinners made me ineligible for TPA or clotbuster drugs. I was placed on a heart monitor where an atrial fibrillation was immediately revealed. In normal heart rhythm, the atria squeeze the blood into the ventricles at a rate of about once a second. In AFib, there's only a partial squeeze and a rapid jazz rhythm. When the heart converts back to sinus rhythm or a normal heart rhythm, the resulting full squeeze sends the blood clots into circulation, and some of them end up in your brain. This time, a new MRI showed a left pontine infarct, a brainstem stroke. The neurologist said she was waiting for arteriography results to see if there was evidence of a thrombosis. I asked her if there were any surgical options other than the Mercy retriever. This procedure involves inserting a corkscrew-type device into the blood clot and drawing it backwards. Under the best circumstances, this works about half the time. The neurologist said she wasn't aware of other procedures, and the hospital I was in did not do surgical interventions. I proceeded to have an unbearably difficult conversation with my wife. In a brainstem stroke, there's a possibility of being left with locked-in syndrome, where most of the cranial nerves no longer function. The story of Jean-Dominique Bauby, the editor of the French version of Elle magazine, is told in The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. He dictated the book one letter at a time, using eye blinks, because locked-in syndrome had left him completely paralyzed, but cognitively intact. Before our conversation could get too melancholy, the neurologist returned with the news that the MRA had shown no evidence of a blood clot. I felt a euphoria that persists to this day. I would be taking blood thinners for the rest of my life, as well as medication to control my heart arrhythmia. Most of the doctors that I met treated me like a series of body parts. If the two neurologists that I saw when I first had symptoms had bothered to monitor my heart, perhaps the AFib that caused my stroke would have been detected. As my cardiologist said later, if you go to a pizza guy, you get pizza. There was no movement in my right arm and my right leg. The right facial droop was much more pronounced at rest, much less so when I smiled. The wonderful intensive care nurse asked me in the gentlest way if I needed to see anybody or take anything for depression. I remember answering something flip like, "Yay, I had a stroke." But honesty requires that I report to you 2 instances of emotional instability, if not emotional incontinence. Our professional literature uses the term emotional lability to talk about emotional outbursts. I've always told my colleagues and my students that emotional incontinence describes the symptoms better, and I was now experiencing them. Lability means a loss of control. Incontinence means an overflow. Nobody would ask a person who is incontinent of the bladder, "Why are you peeing?" But individuals with emotional incontinence are often asked, "What's wrong?" when they start to sob. The first instance has to do with, of all things, a muffin. After I was in intensive care for a few days, I had a notion that I wanted a muffin that I saw in a food service tray. I asked my wife several times, more than several times, over the next couple of days, why she couldn't get me a muffin. She had been to hell and back with me. She hadn't showered in days, and she was sleeping in a reclining chair. When she finally got me a muffin, it tasted great, but I felt like a jerk. The next instance had to do with our adult daughter. Elizabeth lives in New Haven, Connecticut, and we refused to allow her to travel 4 hours each way so she could spend 5 minutes with me. When I spoke to her on the phone, it was all I could do to keep from blubbering, and my dysarthria became worse. After I was transferred to a rehab facility in New York City where I would spend the next 3 weeks, I got to see Elizabeth often, and I had better control. The staff in the rehab facility were surprised when they took my case history. "What kind of work do you do?" "I'm a professor." "Oh, what do you teach?" "This." What surprised me was how my limited neural resources would affect my speech. Physical exertion, such as I experienced in PT and OT, recruited most of what I had left in terms of neural allocation. So my voice became high-pitched, breathy, and thin, and my speech articulation got worse. There have been times in the past where I worked or played to exhaustion, but the profound sense of utter fatigue that I experienced from therapy was unlike anything I had ever felt before. We worked the right side muscles, and they went into failure long before the rest of my body knew to stop. When my body finally quit, I was depleted beyond description. It was up to the therapists to tell me to take rest periods, as if they knew my body better than I did. Well, we haven't talked about money. The old adage of saving for a rainy day is certainly appropriate. When you have a stroke, financially, it's raining. I'm lucky in that I had a job I could return to, and with the stroke occurring just before summer break, I didn't have to take a medical leave of absence without pay. I'm also lucky to have a life partner who is a teacher, so she could be with me for the first 2 months. But what I didn't anticipate was being denied coverage for all my medical expenses by my insurance provider. There were many hours spent on the phone at the rehab center and at home talking to bureaucrats, clerks, and receptionists. Everyone gave me different answers to my questions. Nobody ever called back. The daily mail delivery was approached with dread, as each day seemed to bring a new enormous hospital or doctor bill with coverage denied. Finally, at the end of August, I had an advocate in a wonderful woman whom I hadn't called, but who called me. She told me I had done nothing wrong and that she would work to resolve the problem. On Wednesday morning, September 4th, she called to say that all the medical expenses would be covered. I found out where she worked and brought her a big bouquet of flowers. Back home in the apartment, I was delighted to see how well Shelley and the building manager had modified the second bathroom to allow me independence in showering. The tub chair, the grab bar, the shower hose were just the same as the ones in the OT apartment in rehab. Later, when I showered, it was bliss, the first time in a month that I was able to shower without assistance. I can't help it, but I'm feeling like less of a man. There are certain household chores, like changing the bulb in a ceiling fixture or tightening the screws in a balky hinge, that I can't do anymore. I'm also putting pressure on myself and my wife to have sex. We've been married over 40 years, and this is the longest we've ever gone without it. For the first few weeks, it wasn't even on the radar screen. And I'm concerned that I might be trying to force the issue before I'm ready. Shelley is also unsure of what I can do, and she's requesting frequent hugs. I don't feel fragile anymore, but my right side is still plenty weak. My beautiful bride invited me into the bedroom. Everything worked. And it was much better than a muffin. Regarding lessons learned, I know how lucky I am to have recovered so well from a paralyzing stroke. Therapy works if you are compliant, but I know from providing about 30,000 therapy visits to thousands of stroke patients that most stroke survivors are not compliant. My advice must have been effective because it worked for me. Also, the speech-language pathologist at the rehab center told me that her department was using my textbook. I have to be careful and mindful when I swallow so I don't choke, when I walk so I don't fall, when I speak so I don't slur. But this increased need for awareness has an upside in that I live more in the moment, taste my food more, appreciate my surroundings more, and I hope speak more meaningfully to you. And finally, last June, I danced at my daughter's wedding. Thank you.